So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Chatham Conservation Partnership webinar. Today, we're talking about bumblebees and bumblebee conservation. Our first speaker is going to be Hannah Levinson, Dr. Hannah Levinson with North Carolina State University. And Hannah's going to talk about North Carolina bumblebees, their biology, diversity, and threats. Take it away, Hannah.
Great, thanks, Debbie. Happy to be here today. All right, hi everyone. So my name's Hannah Levinson. I'm a postdoctoral research scholar at North Carolina State University, and I'll talk to you about North Carolina bumblebees today. So first, I just wanted to start talking about bees in general. Bees are one of the most diverse groups of insects. You can see from this slide here that they come in all shapes, sizes, colors, and this can make them really exciting to work with, but also a little tricky to work with. And to give you an idea of the numbers that we have, in North Carolina, we have 564 different species of bees. In North America, there are more than 5,000 different species, and across the world, there are more than 20,000. And a lot of these bee species can act differently from each other. They live in different places. And so this can make conserving them and focusing on certain species really hard because one thing might work for one species, but not another. So a really important first step in working to conserve and protect bees is first learning their identity so that you can understand what they need, what resources they need, and what we can do to help them. So today I'm going to start explaining kind of the broader group of bees and some of these differences I've mentioned, and then we'll move into talking about bumblebees and how they fit into this big picture of bees as a group. So when we talk about conserving something, it's always great to talk about why we care first. With bees, that's really easy, and I'm sure with this group, I don't even have to do this, but I'm going to do a small obligatory introduction to why we want to conserve bees. So first and foremost, bees are pollinators. They provide pollination services to the vast majority of flowering plants and the majority of the most important crops that provide us food. And it's not just bees that provide pollination, but bees are really the major source of these pollination services in our landscapes. And you may have heard the phrase that you can thank bees for every 1/3 of your food. And that's not exactly true. It's kind of been muffled through a worldwide game of telephone. Bees are, of course, important for pollination, but we would not starve without bees. The crops that bees pollinate make up less than 10% of the total caloric intake for the human diet. We mainly get a lot of our calories from mostly crops that are wind pollinated, like grains, rice, potatoes, but we would probably have some serious health issues, and we would definitely have less fun with the food we're eating. So the majority of crops that bees do pollinate are where we get our really important vitamins and nutrients in our diets, especially vitamins A and C. So we would have serious health consequences without bees. And many of you may have seen this picture. On the left side of the screen, we have a breakfast with bees pollinating all of the foods that we like to eat. You can see there's a diversity of fruits. We have nuts, lots of good vitamins and nutrients in this diet. And then on the right side of the screen, we have the breakfast without bees, and you can see a lot is missing. That would be less fun to eat. And for these pollination services, the majority of that does come from honeybees. About 50 to 80% of crop pollination is from honeybees. Even though they are not native to North America, they were introduced from Europe. But they are really important for our agricultural system, mainly because they are a managed species. They live in hive boxes. We can pick them up, we can move them around, we can manipulate how they act in the landscape. So they are very important for how our agricultural system is set up. But the remaining pollination services do come from our native wild bees and other animal pollinators. So obviously still very, very important. And on top of that, having a diversity of pollinators within a system has been shown to improve pollination services. So it's not just the number of pollinators in an area that's important to think about, it's how many different kinds of pollinators are in an area. And one example I'll show here is with strawberries. So you can see the strawberry flower on the left. It has a pretty big surface area in the middle. That entire surface area needs to be pollinated. And on the right-hand side, we have 3 different images of strawberries with varying levels of pollination services that were provided during bloom. And you can see that without proper pollination, while some plants may still produce a fruit or still produce seed, it could be very minimal. It will be misshapen, misformed. And so strawberries are a great example where they do need multiple different kinds of bees visiting the flower, because all these bees do have different behaviors to get the nice aesthetic strawberry that we all like to see and like to eat. And like I mentioned, it's not just bees that provide this pollination. There are lots of different insects as well as mammals that can provide pollination. But bees are really considered a keystone species because they are the only pollinators that consume pollen and nectar as both larvae and adults. So bees are going out to flowers. They are purposely collecting pollen. So they are the most efficient pollinator compared to these other pollinators. Okay, so now I want to get into learning more about the different bee species that we have and how they can differ from each other. So all organisms need 2 main things to survive: food and shelter. And bees also need these 2 things. But how bees, different bee species, get their food and where they shelter is the main way in how they could be very different from each other. So when bees go to flowers, they collect 2 sources of food: pollen and nectar. Pollen is providing them with their main source of protein, amino acids, as well as many micronutrients. Nectar is providing them with carbohydrates as well as other micronutrients, and together they need both of these to successfully raise their young. Once food is collected, all bees go through this general life cycle. So we'll start in the upper left corner with the egg. So a bee starts as an egg. It gets the full resource it needs to develop, pollen and nectar ball together. You can see that in that image. And that's what that egg eats within a nest as it develops. So it develops into a larva, then eventually into a pupa, and then it'll merge as an adult. So when bees emerge and when they're flying around as adults, they are fully grown. So when you see a bee and it's small, it's just a small bee. They are done growing. So those adults then go out and forage. They will mate. Then those females will go into nesting. They'll build nests, they'll lay eggs, and the whole cycle starts over again. And depending on the bee species, even though they all go through this life cycle, the rate at which they go through this life cycle can be different. So some species can go through this as quickly as a month. Others take an entire year to complete. And that can really change how we support different bee species and what we need to do to conserve them. So the nests where this happens can also be different. There are 4 main categories of nesting materials that we can group bees into. First, on the left side of the screen, we have soil nesters. So that image there is showing a female bee. She burrows straight into the ground and can build quite extensive tunnels. Within those tunnels, she'll have an individual cell for each egg that gets that pollen and nectar ball like we just talked about, and the bees will actually develop underground. Next, we have wood nesters. So some bees nest in dead sound wood. Other bees nest in dead rotting wood. Then we have stem nesters. Those are our leafcutter bees and our mason bees. They need hollow or pithy stems, and they build their nests within those tunnels. And then we have cavity nesters. So these are our honeybees and our bumblebees. They need open spaces that they then fill in with their nest. And I want to note, I mentioned that honeybees and bumblebees are our cavity nesters. Less than 1% of all bee species, the 20,000 in the world, nest this way. So it's pretty unique in the bee world, but we probably know the most about honeybees and bumblebees, even though they are kind of rare to nest in that way. On the other side of the screen, you'll note the soil nesters. 70% of all bee species nest this way. So the majority of bees are nesting underground, and we definitely know significantly less about those bee species, even though they make up the majority of bees. Okay, so we know a little bit more about where bees are living. How they interact with each other within those nests can also be different depending on the species. So I'm showing here a spectrum of sociality. On one side of the screen, we have solitary, the other we have highly eusocial. And for time, I'm just talking about these 2 extremes, but it really is a spectrum. And there's lots of different ways that bees can live that are in intermediate points between these 2 extremes. So one side, we have solitary bees. The example here is a mason bee in a bee hotel. That is where one female builds her own nest, collects her own food, lays her own eggs. She does everything on her own. She does not get help from another adult to lay her eggs or build that nest. And most of the time, those bees are on an annual life cycle and they don't even meet those eggs that they lay. The adults die off before the young develop. On the other side of the spectrum, we have highly used social species. The example here is honeybees. So there can be thousands or even tens of thousands of adult bees all living together in the same nest. And they have division of labor. So some bees are going out and building the nest, some bees are going out and collecting food. There's a reproductive, some are defending the nest, some are raising the young. They are all working together in different tasks to make sure the nest is successful. And most of the time, these nests persist year after year after year, and there are overlapping generations. So you can imagine these different lifestyles will also drastically change how we need to support different bee species and what we can do to help them. Okay, and then the last difference I'll talk about is how bees collect their food. So again, I'm showing a spectrum. I'm showing the two extremes just for sake of time. There's lots of median points in between these, but on one side we have specialist bees. This is where a species needs to visit a specific family, species, or even genus of bee, flower at certain time, and they need to visit that specific flower to successfully collect pollen and nectar to raise their young. And without that very specialized relationship, they cannot successfully raise their young. Most of the time, this results in a very close mutualistic relationship between the bee and the flower, where that flower also needs that bee to visit that flower for successful pollination. The example I have here is a squash bee and a squash flower. So on the other side of the spectrum, we have generalist pollinators. So if a flower produces pollen and nectar, not all of them do, but if it does, more than likely a generalist pollinator can visit any flower, collect the pollen and nectar, bring it back, and successfully feed it to its young. So there's a lot more flexibility there. Okay, and then I'll end this portion of the talk with talking about some threats to bees. Now, what makes this hard is I mentioned the majority of the bee species we don't know a lot about. That means we also don't know what threats those bee species are facing. And without that, we're not exactly sure how best to protect them. So in North Carolina, the majority of our bee species, I would say, we're not exactly sure what is causing threats to those bee species. But based on broader information we have, it's more than likely many things working together synergistically to create a bigger negative impact. It's more than likely not one single thing that we can point out. It's kind of death by 1,000 cuts. But some of the big stressors that we know do affect bees are the ones listed here, and I'll quickly go through them. So first, I'll start with climate change. So bees can be pretty sensitive to temperatures, especially if we think about there are soil nesters. As soil temperature warms, they really don't have another option. Stem nesters are out in the air. That can have pretty drastic temperature changes. So as temperatures change, that is going to severely affect bees, where they can survive, their distributions across our country. It also changes the flowering times of plants, and so it can change what resources are available to bees. That leads us into habitat loss. So not only are flowering times of plants changing, humans are also continuing to develop the landscape. So as we remove natural areas that have lots of flowering plants, we are removing the food resources that bees need to survive. So if there's not enough flowers around, bees can't get the food that they need. That is then linked to nutrition. So as bees have reduced foraging habitat, they may not get the nutrients they need. I talked about protein from pollen, micronutrients, amino acids. Those are all very vital building blocks for life. And if bees don't get that from the flower resources in the landscape, they can't successfully create the next generation. That's also then linked to pathogens and parasites. So bees can get sick just like us. There's many viruses that affect bees, as well as gut parasites. And if bees aren't getting proper nutrition, they could be more susceptible to getting sick, which then can lead to some population losses. And the last thing, we definitely need to think about pesticides. There's the obvious acute effects of pesticides where there is a spray and we see bee kills, but there's more and more information coming out that there's actually many chronic, long-term sublethal effects that we don't truly understand, but are definitely affecting bees. They're affecting their brain function, they're affecting how they fly and forage. So there's a lot we still don't understand about that stressor, and it's definitely one that we need to be cognizant of. Okay, so that is our big introduction to bees in general. And now I want to talk about how do bumblebees fit into the pollinator community. So when we're talking specifically about bumblebees, there's about 15 species in North Carolina. I'll get into that number in a couple slides. There's 47 in North America and 265 in the world. So still a good amount of diversity within this one group of bees. When we're thinking about those life history traits we just talked about, bumblebees are cavity nesters, so they are kind of unique in the bee world. They need an open space that they then fill with their nest. They are generalist pollinators, so they are able to visit a wide variety of plants to collect pollen and nectar from. And they are a social species, so they can have hundreds or even up to 1,000 individuals in one colony, all working together for the success of that colony. So they do have a division of labor. Some are foraging and collecting food, some are helping raise the young, some are defending the nest, and there is a queen that is responsible for laying all the eggs. But bumblebee colonies are on an annual life cycle, so they do not last more than 1 year. And to show you a little more details about what I mean by that, here is the bumblebee life cycle. So they still go through that life cycle we talked about before, where they're eggs, then larvae, then pupa, then adults. But now we're talking about the time scale that they do this at. So first we'll start at the middle picture in the spring right now. There are bumblebee queens out foraging, collecting resources so that they can start a brand new colony. So then they will find an area to lay their nest. So you can see here's some examples of some cavities. It could be under rocks. It could be an old rodent burrow underground. It could be within a log. Many times they nest in bunches of grass or in human structures that happen to have a cavity. Sometimes people find them in their bird boxes. So anything that gives them a small little cavity that they can fill with their nest. So in the early summer, the queen will lay eggs and start raising those eggs. She's still collecting food and feeding them. Those then hatch into workers. Once she has workers in her colony, she doesn't leave the colony anymore. The workers go out, collect the food, and bring it back, and she continues to lay more and more eggs. So in the late summer or fall, that is where the colony is going to be the largest. There's going to be lots of workers. And to show you an example of a real bumblebee colony, here's a picture actually that Debbie took. It was in I think a shed that had some insulation, and they just found a little cavity within that insulation to build their colony. So in the upper right corner, we see that larger bee, that's the queen. She's on some egg cells, she's laying eggs. We then see workers that are helping take care of the larvae once they hatch. In the middle there, we see some honey pots. So they have like a shiny black dot in the middle. That's actually a little pot where there's some nectar turning into honey in there. That's the food resource for the colony. And then in the upper right, we have larger cells. Those are pupa that are about to emerge as more workers that can then help take care of the colony. Okay, so also in the fall, that's when the colony starts producing reproductives. So they will produce brand new queens and males. Those brand new queens and males then go out and mate. The males don't make it through the winter. The brand new queens do make it through the winter. They'll find a place usually under leaf piles or somewhere in shallow ground, and they will overwinter. They're going to like a semi-hibernation state. Wait until the spring, they'll emerge and the whole cycle starts over again. So those brand new mated queens that are going into hibernation, those are the only individuals from the colony that survive the winter. The rest of the workers, the old queens, the males, they do not survive through the winter. And bumblebees are a really important pollinator in our ecosystems and within the pollinator community. And there's 3 main reasons why. The first is physiology. The second is tongue length, and the third is size and strength. So physiology, bumblebees can do something called muscular thermogenesis. That is where the same muscles they use to fly, they can actually just vibrate their body, and this is how they warm themselves up. Other bee species aren't able to do this in this way. So what that means is that bumblebees are able to fly in colder temperatures than a lot of other bee species. So they can fly earlier in the day when it's still chilly, later in the day when it's starting to get chilly again. They can also fly earlier in the season than other bee species. So there's not a lot of bee species in North Carolina that are active right now, but bumblebees are becoming active. And then across the year, they can also fly in cooler and wetter temperatures than other bee species. So this is a really important characteristic to have in our landscape because there's not a lot of other bees that can provide pollination services during these times when bumblebees can. Next is tongue length. So bumblebees, depending on the species, have a range of tongue lengths, but many species have what we consider long tongue lengths. To give you an idea, if it is helpful, that can be between 6 to 18 millimeters long. But what that means is that bumblebees are able to collect pollen and nectar from flower shapes that other bee species aren't able to. Some of you in your own gardens may have noticed that there's a lot of bumblebees on tubular flowers. That's because their long tongues can reach into that flower and other bee species may not be able to reach that resource. So that is, again, an example of where bumblebees are filling a little niche in the bee community that's really important. And they can also be very efficient pollinators because of this. The next is size and strength. So bumblebees do something called buzz pollination. And we have a little video here to show you what that is. So the same muscles that bumblebees use for flight, they use to warm their bodies, they can also vibrate flowers. So what we're looking at here is a tomato flower. A bumblebee is latched onto the anther that is producing the pollen. And vibrating her body. And you can see that pollen is being released out of that and just pouring onto her body. She'll then collect and take back to the nest. So not all bee species are able to buzz pollinate. For example, honeybees are not able to successfully pollinate tomato flowers, but bumblebees can because they do this buzz pollination. So bumblebees are very important for various crops that need buzz pollination. Some examples are tomatoes, peppers, clover, just to name a few. And so without this, these flowers would not be properly pollinated. And it's estimated that about 8% of all flowers benefit from buzz pollination. So that is a huge portion of the flower community that bumblebees are really important for pollinating. The other thing with size and strength is that bumblebees are able to fly quite large distances. It's estimated that they can fly between 900 feet to about 2 miles. That's really far, and maybe the average is about a mile, but that's pretty far if you imagine a small bumblebee being able to fly over a mile. So what that means is that one bumblebee colony in an area can provide pollination services for the radius out around that colony. So that's really important in our landscapes because other smaller bee species are not able to forage at these distances. So they would need to have nests more often throughout the landscape. Okay, and then when we talk about threats, the same threats affect bumblebees. Of the bee species in North Carolina, we do know a little bit more about bumblebees. So we do have some evidence of certain threats that we know are causing population declines in certain bumblebee species. Again, all of these are important. They're all working together in worsening the effects. But we do have evidence that climate change and parasites are affecting bumblebee populations. Climate change, because bumblebees do fly in those cooler temperatures, as temperatures warm, their population ranges are going to retreat into high elevation areas and high latitude areas in our country. And then parasites, there are gut parasites that have been linked to population losses of certain bumblebee species. So we do know these two things are issues. All of them are issues, but we can start to work to protect these bumblebee species because we know more about what threats they're facing. All right, so then in the last little bit, I want to talk about bumblebee species specifically in North Carolina. So these are the 15 species that are considered to be in North Carolina. What we're showing is the species names. Then we have the IUCN ranking. So CR is critically endangered, EN is endangered, BU is vulnerable. LC is low concern, and then at the bottom, DD is data deficient. So even within bumblebees, I said we know a little bit more about this group of bees. There's even some species that are data deficient, which means we do not know if they are low concern, if they're critically endangered, what threats are specifically facing those species. We do not have enough data to make a decision about that. So we still have more work we need to do, even within this group of bees that we know a little bit more about. And then we also have the fish and wildlife ranking for the US. So we have one species that historically was in North Carolina, Bombus affinis, we'll talk about in a second. That's listed as endangered. And then we have 3 species that are listed to be petitioned or are petitioned to be listed as endangered. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about quickly is a little bit about identifying bumblebees compared to other bees. And the main question that we get is, how do we know the difference between a bumblebee and a carpenter bee? So on the left image, I'm showing a bumblebee. On the right image, I'm showing a carpenter bee. And there's a couple key body parts that you should look at. The first is the abdomen here. So if you look at the carpenter bee, the image on the right, you'll see that the abdomen is very shiny. It does not have hair. It's very reflective. It's actually reflecting an image of the environment that this bee is in. So that is pretty unique to carpenter bees compared to bumblebees. If you look at the left picture, you can see the bumblebee abdomen is dull. It is not shiny. That's because bumblebees always have hair all the way down their abdomen. They will not reflect. It may be different colors of yellow and black depending on the species, but there will always be hair there. So that's a big one. The next thing is where they carry their pollen. So different bee species carry their pollen on different parts of their body. So like leafcutter bees and mason bees carry pollen on the underside of their body, on their belly. Other bee species carry it back internally in their stomach. And then we have 2 other ways here. So bumblebees and honeybees are the only species in North Carolina that form pollen balls. So you can see the arrow is pointing on her back leg. She has pollen packed very neat and tidy into a pollen ball on her hind leg. Carpenter bees will carry pollen all over their hind leg. They do not make pollen balls. So if this carpenter bee had pollen on her leg, it would look like this, where there's yellow all up and down. And that's because the hairs on their legs are actually structurally different. So on the left side, we see the bumblebee hind leg in that red box. You can see that she has a shiny part. It's like a little cavity, a little dip in her leg. And then she has very long hairs on the outside. So this is what we call a pollen basket, or the corbicula. So she will put the pollen in that shiny part, and the hairs help close in and hold that pollen on her leg. So that's a very specific structure that only honeybees and only bumblebees have. Carpenter bees on the other side of the screen, they have hairs all up and down their hind leg, and all of those hairs will help carry pollen. So even if you see a bee that is colored like a bumblebee, it looks like a bumblebee, if it does not carry pollen in a pollen ball, it cannot be a bumblebee. Okay, so with that, I want to talk about some of the species we have in North Carolina. So the first one is Bombus affinis, or the rusty patched bumblebee. This is the bumblebee species that is listed as endangered in the US. In this map, you can see the green dots are the historic, the black dots are the historic range, so where it once was, and the green dots are where it's currently. So you can see how small its range is now. It's actually lost about 80%, 87% of its historic range. And we do think that a lot of this is due to warming temperatures. This is a cooler temperature species. So it's in the higher elevations. When it was in North Carolina, it was mostly found in high elevations in our mountains. And it was last seen in 1994. So even if we do find it again in North Carolina, it's likely going to be restricted to the mountains. It's very unlikely that with warming temperatures, it would move into other regions of the state. But currently, North Carolina is not considered a good habitat for this species anymore. Okay, next we have Bombus terricola. So you can see again, black dots are the historic range and the white dots are the current range. So again, this has lost quite a bit of its range. It's lost about 37% of its range. Its range is now becoming more and more fragmented. So different populations are no longer able to interchange individuals with each other. It was never common in North Carolina, but where it is common, it's in the mountains. So again, it's a cooler temperature, higher elevation, higher latitude species. And so we are expecting this range to restrict as the temperatures change. Next, we have Bombus variabilis. This is petitioned to be listed as endangered. And in fact, there's concern that it may already be extinct. It has not been seen in quite some time anywhere in the US. And the last time it was seen in North Carolina was in 2006. And one of the reasons that this species may be in decline is it's actually a parasitic bee, a cuckoo bee. If anyone's ever heard of the cowbird, where the cowbirds will sneak into the nest of another bird, lay their egg, and then the host bird unknowingly raises the cowbird's eggs. Parasitic bees do the same thing. So this bee will sneak into the nest of another bee species, Bombus pennsylvanicus, which we'll talk about in a second, lay its own eggs, and then the Bombus pennsylvanicus bees will unintentionally raise the Bombus variabilis eggs instead. So because Bombus pennsylvanicus is also a species of concern, is also declining, it's thought that because Bombus variabilis, its success so closely relies on Bombus pennsylvanicus, that as we lose one species, we're going to lose this other species. So it's an example of how connected these species can be in the landscape, and things that affect one species will have effects on other species as well. So with that, I'll move into Bombus pennsylvanicus. So again, we have the map where the black dots are the historic range, the white dots are the current range. And this is a happier story. It's actually still regularly seen in North Carolina. Most of the range loss, unlike these other species we've talked about, is actually in the northern regions of our country. So this is hopeful because maybe North Carolina can be a really important area for working to protect this bee because we still see it so often. So this is one that we should all look out for in North Carolina and work to support for sure, because North Carolina may end up being a really important spot for this bee. And I want to finish with talking about some common bees. So these are bees, they are not really of concern. They are found in many areas across at least the eastern seaboard into the western portion of the country a little bit. And that's Bombus impatiens, this first bee here, Bombus bimaculatus, and Bombus griseoculus. And I also want to highlight these three to show that bumblebee species can be pretty difficult to distinguish between. These three species look very similar. They are very hard to tell apart when you're first learning. And the main thing to look at is the yellow banding. So you may see in those drawings of the bees below that Bombus impatiens has a single yellow band. Bombus bimaculatus on the second segment has those little two dots. That's where it gets its name. And then Bombus griseoculus has that golden brownish U shape on the second segment of its body where it gets its name, the brown belted bumblebee. So there's more to learn with identifying these bees. And if you're interested in that, you can look up this document. I didn't have time to go into more about identification today, but you can scan the QR code or you can just Google the title. This is available for free as a PDF through NC State Extension for everyone. It's co-authored by myself and Elsa Youngstead at NC State. And we go through identification tips for bumblebees, especially those species I just mentioned, but also other bees in North Carolina. So for time, if you want to know more, you can look at this resource. All right, so with that, I want to wrap up with things that we should think about going forward that we need to know more about in order to support bumblebees. So first, there's a lot we still don't understand about queen overwintering. We don't really know the survival rate, how many queens go out and hibernate versus how many survive into the spring. We also don't know a lot about how they're hibernating, how far down they're burrowing, more about where they're burrowing so we can help protect those really important bees. Also, definitely need to think about the effects of soil temperature as those warm and as those change, because the entire colony, as well as the overwintering queen, all are going to be affected by changing soil temperatures. We also need to know more about what species are thriving, which are struggling. We do have those data deficient species still, and why they are thriving or why they are struggling. That includes learning more about their habitat requirements, what we need to provide to them to help support them, the different stressors that are impacting them, and those stressors may impact different species differently. So learning all of those nuances will be really important. And then how can we support bumblebee populations as a whole? So the following presentations by Debbie and Lori will get into how we are currently working to answer some of these questions. But there's definitely a lot more that we all can do together in North Carolina to help support bumblebees. So with that, thank you for listening and thank you for the invitation to speak today. And hopefully I saved a good amount of time for any questions that we have.
You do, Hannah. That was great. We have about 10 minutes for questions. So please put questions in the chat. Let me double check here. There was one question, but it was really more of a plant question. Yeah, let's pause here if people have questions. I'll put a link to that wonderful Bees of North Carolina publication. That'll be in the email I send out. I refer to that a lot. It's really wonderful. Whenever I write anything about bees, I always go back to that. It's got a lot of information in it. So y'all will enjoy that. Yeah.
Sharing.
Okay. Here's one. Is there an iNaturalist project where we should be reporting our sightings?
That is a good question. There is something called Bumblebee Watch, so you can look that up. That happens across the country. Lori will also talk about a specific Southeastern project that you can be a part of to help with that. But also just iNaturalist in general is great, and there are researchers that will pull from all of iNaturalist. But there is a specific Bumblebee Watch if you're interested in participating in that.
Mhm. So would you say that nightshade veggies require pollination from the bumbles?
Yes. I mean, I can't speak for every plant species in that group, but that flower structure, yeah, it needs buzz pollination.
Yeah, I've been on farms. I love seeing like with the eggplants, which is one of the solanaceous crops. I love seeing the big bumblebees, sonicate those flowers. It's really a beautiful thing. And you can hear the difference. It's really neat.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure.
Another question, can one buy native bumblebees?
So there are some Bombus impatiens colonies. There are two main companies that you can buy some commercial colonies from those companies. That is a species that is native to North Carolina. I will say though that there are some concerns with buying commercial bumblebees about those gut parasites that in those facilities with lots of bumblebees, it would be many, many colonies altogether, that those gut parasites can build up. And there's also concerns where if Bombus impatiens is not native in your area, even though you can still buy it commercially, if you put it out in the environment, that would change the species composition in your environment. So depending on, if you need pollination on your farm or something, there are bumblebee colonies that are available. If you are just a homeowner, I would more recommend working to provide good habitat in your landscape for bumblebees so that naturally occurring colonies can have a good place to start a colony on your land rather than bringing in commercial bumblebees. So depending on the context, there are a couple options.
And Hannah, something I've been meaning to ask you. So most of the farmers that I know that purchase bumblebees are doing it in enclosed spaces, greenhouses. I know of at least one farmer though who does buy what he calls quads for his pumpkin fields. Do you know, are there a lot of because I know you've worked on this statewide, I think. Are there a lot of farmers that are bringing in domesticated bumblebees for their field crops?
Yeah, I think there are blueberry pollination is a big thing that people bring in honeybees, but also sometimes bumblebees
Mm-hmm.
as an example of another crop. So there are several different field crops across the country really where people will be buying these commercial bumblebees and bringing them in. And if you don't close the colony or remove the colony at the end of the year, it will produce queens that then can go out and hibernate. So at least in North Carolina, Bombus impatiens is the main commercially available species. At least that is one that is native to North Carolina, but you are still bringing in bees from this commercial facility into our landscape.
Mm-hmm. We have a few, yeah, that is worrisome to me. A few more questions. Let's see. I live on 2 acres on a wooded lot. I think I'm going to answer that question, John. He's asking what are a couple of things I can do to be a good native bee steward. I think I'll be tackling that. What's
Yeah.
the deal with bumblebees sleeping in flowers?
Oh, yeah. So actually a couple different species you might see do that, and that's typically the males. So the males really aren't contributing, building the nest, laying the eggs, collecting the food. Their males are really there for mating in bees. And so many times males of different species don't necessarily need to go back to the nest at the end of the day. They're just hoping to find females to mate with. So they'll stay in flowers overnight and then hopefully meet a female the next day, basically.
This is a little bit off topic, but you did talk about ground nesting bees. Do you have any guidance on facilitating ground dwelling bees? Soil type, I basically how to, help, excuse me.
Mhm.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Yeah, how to
that
help that. Stop.
that's great. And I know Debbie also has lots of information about this from her own pollinator garden. I don't know if you'll get into that today, but basically, ground nesting bees are going to need soil that is somewhat open and uncovered. So if we're mulching everything, that's going to affect their access to the soil. Obviously, if we're developing everything and paving it, that's going to limit their access to the soil. So typically they need patchy, grassy areas. Typically, it's going to be in sunny areas. If it's more clay type soil, you can expect to see them on sloped areas so that they are ensuring that water drains properly out of that soil. If it's more well draining or sandy soils, we're finding them in more flat areas. So the best thing we know right now is that when you find an aggregation of ground nesting bees, just work to protect that area because they are pretty picky. So once they find an area, that means that that area had the specific requirements they need for successful nests. And we don't yet know the best way to like add more of that kind of area back into the landscape. So it's more about protecting what's already there. Especially these aggregations can get quite large. So just working to protect them.
And they will reuse those nesting sites year after year. Yeah, I'll send a link out to a recent article I wrote about that.
Great.
So why would bumblebees hang out near the compost bins, rain barrel areas, and dive bomb gardeners? Probably because there's a nest nearby. It's kind of scary when they seem to aim at your face.
Yeah, that could be a couple different species, but several different bees, they sometimes visit areas that are kind of soggy, and that's where they get water for their nest. So if it's soggy mulch, they may go actually drink the water out of that mulch. But also if it's an area that collects salts and minerals, they will collect that as well. So it could be something that's like in the soil there that they are collecting to bring back to their nest.
Mm-hmm. There's a question, are carpenter bees that bad?
Yes, this is a great question. So carpenter bees are pollinators. They do go out and pollinate. I know that we see them nesting in wooden structures and it's a little scary, but they will reuse tunnels. So once they build a tunnel, they aren't necessarily continuing to excavate the entire wooden structure. Over time, those tunnels could expand. But they are pollinators and they build nests and they lay their little babies in the woods. So yeah.
I think this is the last question because I'm going to be talking about the leaves a little bit. How
Great.
are the bumbles counted in general? Where are the nests found? Is this all calculated at certain times of the year?
So maybe that question was when I mentioned how many individuals we could expect in a colony. So that was done, we do know more about those nests because we do have commercial nests, so we can see how those nests develop, but there has been research looking at bumblebee nests. Because they are cavity nesters, they're a little more easier to manage and manipulate than a lot of the ground nesting bees, so we just know a little bit more about those nests. And then, yeah, the colonies will build up over time, and the fall is going to be where they're most likely at their peak. Did I answer the whole question?
I think so, but
Okay.
it's funny because Hannah and I were just talking about how exciting and difficult it is to find a bumblebee nest, because we were at a farm and we were watching a bumblebee queen, fly around, and we were thinking, oh, she probably has a nest nearby. And I except for that one nest where she showed a picture that I had taken where they had nested inside of a well house, I've never found a wild bumblebee nest, and I would just die happy if I did. I
Yeah,
want to find one like in a field, in a grass field, but they're hard to find,
they are.
because they're good at hiding them. So
Yeah.
yeah, there's people that's their job, right, Lori? They go out and look for bumblebee nests. So yeah, if you find one, let me know in Chatham County. I know they nest in rock walls too. Those are a little bit easier to see. Okay, so we are perfectly on time. You also had a comment, Hannah. Wonderful presentation. I totally agree. So
Thanks.
thank you for that. So we're gonna switch gears. We're gonna swap. It's gonna be my turn now. Let me get this going here. All right, how does that look?
Looks good.
Okay. So yes, so I'm going to be talking about, we had a couple of questions already about plants and about what can I do in my yard, in my landscape for a bumblebee. So hopefully I'll answer a few of those questions. Um, there we go. So I'll be talking about some specific plants, be talking a little bit about creating habitat, and then directing you to some resources. And the background here, just to mention in case some of y'all are not aware, I'm coming at this from my experience with my Pollinator Paradise demo garden here in Pittsburgh. A lot of y'all have probably been there. This was a demonstration garden that I created in 2008. So last year was the 15-year anniversary. It has grown over the years. We now have over 225 species in the garden. Most of those are native. I manage it organically. I have a small group of volunteers that help me. The whole purpose of the garden is to use it as an outreach tool. So I do lots and lots of tours, usually about 40 tours a year, public tours and private tours. But I also use it kind of for my own teaching lab. I document things, I observe things. I used it to inform this very presentation. I love taking pictures. So I have literally thousands and thousands of pictures of all the critters, and that gives me information, so much data and information over the years that I can use. So that's, taught me so much about plants and wildlife. So all of the pictures in this presentation I took in the garden. So I'm hoping to lure some of you there if you haven't been there already. But let's start out by talking about plants for bumblebees. Now, I'm kind of sharing with you, this is not an exhaustive list. There's many, many plants for bumblebees. How did I choose the plants that I'm sharing with you today? So these are based on my really about 20 years of observing and documenting bees and other pollinators, because before I did the pollinator garden, I had my own bee garden. Like I said, I've just been kind of watching them, observing, trying out different plants and noticing what bumblebees favor. I also consulted different plant lists, and I'm going to be sharing those with y'all in that email that I mentioned. Lori's going to be talking next about the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas project. So when people submit data, when our citizen scientists submit data to that project, they usually name the plant that the bumblebee was foraging on. So they now have data not only about the type of bee, but what plant was it foraging on. So Lori was shared with me the data on the plant. So I was able to, cross-reference that list with my list that I came up with, and no surprise that we're very similar. I'm also going to be sending you a link to the Lady Bird Johnson website has this list called Plants of Special Value to Bumblebees. That data also came from the Xerces Society, which if I haven't mentioned, I'm sorry. The Southeast Bumblebee Atlas project is a project of the Xerces Society, which Laurie will tell you about next. So, and that data from the Lady Bird Johnson website provided by Xerces was from the Bumblebee Watch. So lots and lots of data. So that's how I came up with these plants, but I'm only kind of sharing with you a portion of those, of course, but I'm going to leave you with information on how to dive deeper into that if you want to look at, more plants for bumblebees. I basically I'm sharing you ones that I think are easy to grow here, easy to procure at local nurseries, right? And that just do well here in the Piedmont. So let's talk about some basic needs, that bumblebees need. Hannah's already talked about that bumblebees are generalist foragers and that they need pollen and nectar throughout the colony's life. We know that early spring is a critical period because the bumblebee queens are emerging from hibernation and they have to have flowers to forage on. So that's a very critical period because if they can't collect pollen, they can't lay eggs and build up their colony. Also, fall is a critical period because those mated bumblebee queens need to be able to have a diverse source of pollen to build up energy stores to go into hibernation. So what we're looking for is a really a diverse, number of plants, types of plants that provides diversity of blooms that support different species. Bumblebees in general are long-tongue bees, but within the range of bumblebees, the 15 species of bumblebees that we have, and even greater, the 45 species, I think it's 45 or 48 in the US. We have short tongue, it's kind of a continuum, short, medium, and long within all of the bumblebees. I do like to encourage people when selecting plants to plant as many natives as you can. I'm not going to say you should only plant natives. I think there's definitely room for non-native plants. I have non-native plants in my garden. My garden is about 85% native to North Carolina, and the 15% non-native tend to be other native to other parts of the US or the South, or herbs. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But in general, those native plants benefit the wider food web and support more wildlife. So let's kind of jump on into it. So I will say, so as I'm showing you these plants, I'm keeping it simple. I'm not, because I'm going to go kind of quickly. And I was inspired putting this presentation together to create a new handout for y'all that you're going to get. So the handout is going to have a lot more information. It's going to have, it's going to be specific to these plants, to bumblebees, and it's going to have the botanical name, the height, the spread, the color, the bloom time, and the sun requirements. So now we're just going to kind of focus on what it looks like, the common name, and I can share, just what I think about the plant or my experience with it and how much I love it. Because if it made it into this presentation, I pretty much love it. We're going to start out with a few shrubs that are spring blooming. This is a very underutilized shrub, in my opinion. This is dwarf indigo bush, Amorpha herbacea. It's a small shrub. It has these crazy long flower spikes that kind of look like tie-dye, flowers, but more people should be planting this, in my opinion. Kind of got stuck there, not advancing. Hang on. There we go. But look at that pollen. It's amazing. And so I just love it. And the bees love it. You can tell I've got full pollen baskets there. And so it attracts a lot of different native bees, but especially the bumbles tend to really like it. So that's dwarf indigo bush. Of course, the pussy willows are really great for early bloomers during that critical spring period. And I honestly, this is one I actually took this picture, but not in the pollinator garden because I don't really have room for willows, but I did just find a species called Salix humilis, which is more of an upland species. It can take drier soil that I'm hoping I can get in the garden. But in general, this is for moist soil, bigger sites. But if you could have room for that, try to get in some willow species. Very good for early spring. Okay. New Jersey tea, Ceanothus, is a nice spring or late spring bloomer. It's a deciduous shrub. Attracts many different types of pollinators. You can see the very full pollen baskets on these bumblebees. It's very happy, but it does attract a lot of other bees and other pollinators as well. Red buds, of course, really great for bumbles, also for honeybees that like it to build up those initial honey stores. So those are some great shrubs for the spring. And now we're moving into perennials, herbaceous perennials. I've got lots of different species of indigo, baptisia in the garden. This here's one of them. Different species, I do have a couple of cultivars, but also many straight species. The only bees I ever see on wild indigo are bumblebees and leafcutter bees. That is it. Never see any other type of bee on indigo. But you can see that it's a great plant, nice, really early bloomer. They're already not all of them, but some of them are in peak bloom right now. So this is early. And then the Baptisia alba is really nice. A single mature plant can have up to 100 flower spikes on this one. I just love this. There's a close-up of those blooms there. Here's another underutilized plant, in my opinion, the tall yellow one there, Carolina lupin, that is Thermopsis villosa. And the flowers look a lot like Baptisia or indigo. As you can see there, next to the white wild indigo. Again, the bumbles really love this one. That one's not quite blooming yet. And again, that handout that I send y'all will give you specific bloom times on this. Curly heads has already been blooming. This again, a nice for that early spring bloom, that critical period. This is a native clematis. It's a non-vining clematis, Clematis ochroleuca. It's a really sweet plant. Another plant that's already blooming is the Gaillardia or blanket flower, Gaillardia aestivalis. There's different species, Pulchella. Here it is mixed with the Golden Alexander, another really early bloomer, so great for critical early spring. The downy woodman is the purple one in the foreground here. That's Blophilia ciliata. Here it is combined with the butterfly weed in the background. The bumblebees are still all over this when it's blooming, and it's really nice and easy to grow. And then of course we have the purple coneflower. I have it listed as a spring bloomer, but honestly, they bloom on and off throughout, even into the fall. And I have a couple of different species of this Echinacea purpurea. I have a couple of different species of coneflower. There's a brown belted bumblebee enjoying that one, but they really love those. And then your Stokes aster, Stokesea laevis, primarily blooms in the spring. It might rebloom a little bit in the fall. There's a close-up of a bumble. This is an evergreen plant. It's pretty short, but really nice, easy to grow. The Anithera is another early bloomer. This is southern sundrops, Anithera fruticosa. It's a kind of a ground cover plant. Southern native. It's quite spready though, but pretty easy to pull out if it goes where you don't want it to go. And then purple prairie clover. This is Dalea purpurea. There's also a white species called Dalea candida. Really packed pollen baskets there. This is not a North Carolina native. It's a southern native. Really nice plant though for bumblebees. And then the milkweeds coming up here. So we have milkweeds that bloom spring and summer. The butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa, starts blooming in May. And that's really nice. We've got milkweeds for all types of habitats. I've got 10 different species of native milkweed in the garden. Butterfly weed, of course, likes it really hot and dry. The red ring milkweed is Asclepias variegata. It likes some shade, but the bumblebees will be happy whatever kind of milkweed you want to put out there. I really like this green milkweed, Asclepias viridis. Really nice. It likes full sun. And then again, these are all the spring bloomers, a couple of other spring bloomers, the clasping milkweed, that's Asclepias and plexical. And then purple is purpurescens. So these are all your early spring blooming milkweeds. If you've got some shade, the wild geranium maculatum is nice, and the bumblebees love that one. And then, of course, we also have lots of monardas or bee balms, different species. They can bloom from spring to fall, depending on what species you're talking about. This is one of my favorites. It's called basil bee balm or white bee balm, Monarda clinopodia. I just love it. It's so pretty. There's a close-up of the flowers, and you can see the bumblebees enjoying herself. This is a fairly short one. It doesn't get probably about 3 feet high. Really nice. And then the wild bergamot, this likes some shade. This is Monarda bradburyiana. Blooms in the spring. And then you have the lemon bee balm, Monarda citriodora in the foreground there. Kind of looks really nice with that. If you'll remember the dwarf indigo bush that I mentioned earlier is in the background there. Looks really nice in combination with that citriodora. Oh, I can see a little bumblebee there on the right, approaching. I didn't even realize that was in the picture, approaching the Monarda there. And here's another different bee balm. This is Monarda fistulosa. This is a cultivar called Claire Grace that just does really well. It's resistant to powdery mildew. So now we're moving into the penstemons, the beard tongues. Again, I've got several species of those. This is Small's beard tongue, Penstemon smallii. This is a pretty early bloomer. So again, good for that critical early spring. And this is really nice, getting ready to bloom. Here's on the left is the Penstemon digitalis, the foxglove beard tongue. And the bumblebees will just go all the way up into that flower with their little butt sticking out, just like you see on the right there. And that's again another picture of the Small's beard tongue, the smallii. And then we have the spiderwort. Whoops, here we go. This is Tradescantia, different species. This can take part shade, it can take full sun. It can be a little aggressive. It can seed in pretty aggressively, but you know, we remove it if it goes where we don't want it to go, but the bumblebees do love it. And it pretty much goes dormant in the summer and then it'll rebloom in the fall. So you can often get two bloom periods out of this one. Okay, so that's some good spring examples. Again, not all of them, just some, you know, I only have so much time here. I can't share all the plants, which is what my heart would like to do, but we don't have time for all of that. So now we're going to look at some summer bloomers, and let's start with some shrubs. One of my all-time favorite shrubs. People are shocked that I have a button bush growing in what is basically a parking lot island, because button bush is known as a wetland plant, and I literally have it growing in a parking lot island surrounded by asphalt. And it does well, so highly adaptable. And it blooms from June to September, sometimes into October. Attracts lots and lots of different pollinators, including, of course, the bumblebees, and just lots of critters like it, and the birds like the seed as well. So again, we're starting out with the shrubs here. Another excellent shrub for bumblebees is the St. John's wort, Hypericum frondosum. And it's just, oh my gosh, they just go crazy. It is a medicinal plant, so I don't know if they're getting a buzz off of the pollen, you know, if it has any effect on them that way, but they just go crazy when they're foraging on the blooms there. But it's a really nice plant. Another really great shrub is a sweet pepper bush. This is Clethra alnifolia, and this is again another very adaptable shrub. It can take full sun or shade. And it's just a beautiful bloom. There's a close-up of the bloom. I just think it's so gorgeous, and the bumblebees really enjoy that. And we can throw a couple of vines in there as well. This is a herbaceous vine, native, called spurred butterfly pea, Centrosema virginiana. I basically planted as a ground cover, and by the way, the deer don't bother it. So here it is growing up, a common milkweed plant. It's gorgeous. It has a very long bloom period. The blooms are only open for the first part of the day. They're pretty much closed by noon. The bumblebees just go crazy over it. Take a drink there, excuse me. Heliopsis is another good one. This is Heliopsis helianthoides, common name oxeye daisy. So we'll see lots of foraging there. That's a fairly tall plant, about 5 feet usually. And then I love the skull caps, the scutellarias. I've got a couple of different species of those. That's a plant that's really grown on me over the years. I just kind of fall in love with it more over the years because even the little seed capsules are beautiful and the fall color. But bumblebees are crazy about it. This is Scutellaria incana or hoary skull cap. And then of course you have the anise hyssop. This is actually called Blue Fortune, Agastache funiculum, Blue Fortune. And you can see that nice long tongue of the bumblebee with the sheath, the protective sheath on each side there. There's a couple of plants that I will direct seed. This is one of them, partridge pea. I highly recommend it. And I never regretted doing this. It's a wonderful plant. It's provided lots of benefits and birds love it, bees love it. I'll talk a little bit more about direct seeding in a little bit. So we also have some milkweeds, of course, that are blooming into summer. Some of the ones I mentioned in the spring will bloom into summer. This is the Asclepias incarnata, pink swamp milkweed. We also have common milkweed that'll bloom in the summer that I do have out there. It's actually one of my favorites. A lot of people poo-poo that one, oh, I can't believe you're planting that pasture weed out there, but it happens to be one of the favorites of the bees. It's a favorite of all of my 10 species of Asclepias in the garden. It happens to be apparently the monarch's favorites as well. And because I have, parking lot islands and things like that, I don't worry too much about it escaping. I mean, I do have to pull it out when it goes where I don't want it to go because it's rhizomatous. It'll spread a lot, but it's a great plant. Great blue lobelia. We got a couple of lobelia species here. This is Lobelia syphilitica. So it's another one that the bumblebees love. And you're probably more familiar with the cousin, the Lobelia cardinalis, the cardinal flower. So you can see they just push their way in there with that large body, American bumblebee. And then Physostegia, we got some double-decker foraging going on here. This is the obedient plant, which I like to joke and call the disobedient plant because it's quite spready, but you still got to love it. It's gorgeous. It blooms for like 2 months, and it's real easy to pull out when it goes where I don't want it to go. So I don't worry too much about that. But you can see it's a favorite of the bumblebees. And then another plant that I was real proud to get out in the pollinator garden was thistle. I knew that thistle was an excellent pollinator plant. You could not find it at local nurseries, and I'm pretty sure that's because it really gets a bad rap because people, when they think of thistle, they think of the roadside thistle, which is a noxious invasive weed. But I wanted the native thistle in my pollinator garden. So several years ago, I just bought some seed, some native seed, and direct seeded it. And this is what I got. And I never looked back. It's wonderful. It has these golf ball size lavender blooms that attract, it's a pollinator party out there. And the plants are like at least 6 feet high, sometimes higher. And I mean, it's amazing all the different pollinators it attracts, including lots and lots of bumblebees, of course. But it's a great plant. It does seed in, but nothing, I don't consider it a problem. We dig out some of the plants if they go where I don't want them to go, but it's a wonderful plant. Never looked back on that one either. So we see that in the fall. Liatris or blazing star. I have several different species of liatris. It is definitely a bumblebee favorite. So you'll definitely want to have some of that in your garden. The neat thing about liatris, so I've recently discovered some fall blooming species. So we'll look at some of that later when we get to the fall section. But it's a great plant. You'll definitely want to have. It's a see-through plant. By that I mean it's tall, but it has such a narrow profile that you can even put it at the front if you want, and you can see through it, see past it. So it's very versatile. You can pretty much put it wherever you want. And then, of course, we have our mountain mints. I think I've got about 8 species of pygnanthemum or mountain mint. That is also a pollinator party. It attracts such a diversity of pollinators and predators as well. So that's a great plant to have and a fun plant to have in the garden. This is Virginia mountain mint, Pygnanthemum virginianum, but you'll definitely want to include that. Another very underutilized plant is Culver's root or Veronicastrum virginicum. That's these candelabra-like, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but spires, these lavender spires here. This is it's mixed with coneflower and bee balm here. This is known as a water-loving, moist-loving plant, but I've got it in perfectly dry beds and it's quite happy. So again, just be willing to experiment. There's a close-up of the bloom and the bumblebee covered in pollen, but it has a really long bloom period, so I really like that. And then, of course, our Joe Pye weed, many different species and all. I have Eutrochium dubium. I love it. This is the coastal Joe Pye weed. Attracts lots and lots of different pollinators, and including, of course, a favorite of the bumblebees. So that's some good examples of some summer blooming. Let's look at some fall blooming species. So asters, you can't go wrong with asters with bumblebees. I've got 12 different species of native aster. And the reason I do that is when I find a plant that's highly attractive to pollinators, then I will, have many different species of it, because that's a great way to extend the bloom season. So that benefits pollinators. If I only had one species of aster, I might get a 3 or 4 week bloom period. But by having 12 different species, I can have a 2-month plus period of bloom. So I'll show you just a couple, and also out of all these different species of aster, they each occupy a different niche in the garden. Some like part shade, some like full sun, some have a mounding, compact growth habit. Some have a very open, airy growth habit. They're all different. Some have tiny little pea-sized flowers like a frost aster. Some have huge flowers like Georgia aster. So again, each one is different. The little Symphyotricum ericoides is a ground cover. It's no taller than 3 inches. So they're all different. This is the New England aster here, with a bumblebee on that. This is a Georgia aster that has the really, really big blooms. Just a couple of the many. Goldenrod, I also have 12 different species of native goldenrod. So what that means is my goldenrod starts blooming in July and goes all the way through November, because I have so many different species, and that really benefits the pollinators. So here's just one of the many species, the gray goldenrod, white goldenrod. This is Solidago bicolor. Here's one of my fall blooming species of Liatris. This is Liatris squarulosa. So I'm just really excited to extend the bloom season of Liatris because I love them so much. So I love being able to find those. Helianthus is also a good one for bumblebees, a swamp sunflower. This is Helianthus angustifolia. And then climbing aster is a woody vine. It's a very vigorous woody vine. This is Ampilaster caroliniana. So this is that vine planted on a trellis. This is such a vigorous vine, you can't even see the trellis. But the neat thing I discovered about it, I experimentally tried, well, I wanted to plant more of it because climbing aster is a very late bloomer. It'll bloom even into the winter, January, and even later if it's a mild winter, which is great. Well, not necessarily for bumblebees, but for other pollinators. And I didn't have any more trellis, so I thought I'm going to try just planting it as a freestanding shrub. I wonder what would happen. What's the worst that can happen? It just kind of goes crazy, but I think if I keep it pruned back, it might work. Well, it does. So it actually makes an excellent shrub. So I have it in 2 spots. I have it planted as a shrub. And that's what we do. We just prune it back hard in the spring, like 3 or 4 times, and then that's it. And then it's it makes a fine freestanding shrub. And as you can see, the bumblebees love that and they enjoy it. That's a great source for them in the late fall before they go into hibernation, you know. And then there's so that's kind of some examples of spring, summer, fall. There are lots of non-native herbs that are also great for bumblebees. I do have lavender. My favorite ones at the garden are I have some lavender, I have the Grosso lavender, and I have ornamental oregano and also culinary oregano. But those are the favorites of the bumblebees. I tried having comfrey, but the deer kept eating it. I have rosemary, but I see more honeybees and carpenter bees on the rosemary than I do bumblebees, but other people keep mentioning it, so I'll put it on there. Okay, so let's talk about, I'm going to finish up with talking about a few things to create bumblebee habitat really quick. So the first thing, I talked about all these plants, plant for your bumblebees. So fall is a great time to plant. You can plant now, of course, but if you're putting in a big installation, I recommend waiting for the fall. There's a few things that I direct seed, mostly I'm planting plants. But these are things that, you know, are really great to direct seed in the fall. And if you want to know how to do that, let me, you know, I'm glad to talk to you about that. I just do it pretty easily. This was my plant crush last year. I have a whole article about it on my website. And bumblebees love late figwort. This is a native plant. Like I said, I'll send you the article on that. It's great to include native grasses. Those also benefit lots of wildlife, but including bumblebees, because they can be a great habitat for bumblebee nest. They can nest at the base of grasses where a cavity can be. So keep that in mind. So there's just some great native grasses that I have out at the garden. I love them. They can be aggressive. We do have to spend some time removing them. Another thing is, you know, if you can, try to leave a portion of your landscape that's undisturbed. So, you know, I know a lot of y'all have to deal with HOAs or whatnot. This might be in the back side of your property, but you know, anything you can do that's where, you know, you can leave a portion of your yard that's not tilled or planted or mowed. That helps conserve that overwintering habitat, nesting habitat. You know, if you've got, you know, brush piles, dead trees, all those things, guess what? They may look unsightly to some people, but they look really, really good to wildlife, you know, and so keep that in mind. And of course, the leaf litter, which I don't like the word litter, as Xerxes says, it's not litter, it's gold, but that's always great. So those are all things that benefit wildlife. And Xerxes started that Leave the Leaves campaign years ago. So I've certainly followed that. There's a lot of critters that overwinter in the leaf layer. And they also provide that insulating layer for bumblebee queens that are hibernating. I actually just took the picture on the left just a few weeks ago. I was so excited to find a DeKay's brown snake in the garden, and if we hadn't left the leaves, it wouldn't have had that habitat. And it was just curled up there. It was still a cold day, so we just left it there. But those are the kind of things that seek shelter in our gardens. It's a very small snake. It's very, very small. Certainly harmless. So I'm happy to have it in the garden. And these black swallowtail caterpillars on the right, that picture was taken in November. And so they will pupate, and it's their chrysalids that will overwinter among the leaf layer. So again, that's why we leave the leaves. Another thing I've done just for fun is a volunteer and I built 2 rock piles in the garden for wildlife in general, including herps, like our Carolina anole friends. But I'm also, one of my goals was I would love to entice some bumblebee queens to nest in there. I would feel so happy. I'm going to do an article on it. I documented the process of building them. Basically, we dug a basement and then created lots of cavities in the basement, including like some terracotta pots that to me look like perfect little size for a bumblebee nest. We'll see. I do know they like to nest in rock walls, so we left lots of entrances, you know, with holes into the rock pile. So it'd be really cool if one day, you know, they decide to take up residence in there. So we'll see. So finally, just ending up, there's some great plant resources. I'm going to send you to my website. I'm getting ready to open up the garden tour schedule. I've got lots of great articles on my website, plant list, a list of the nurseries. I'm going to send a lot of that to y'all. I'll be opening the first garden tour starts May 11th. The tours are free. I do just ask people to register. And then I'll send you that. I'm going to send you these links, North Carolina Plant Toolbox. You can look up all kinds of details. You can look up a plant, find out what plants are deer resistant, what plants like shade, that kind of thing. And then here's the Lady Bird Johnson one that are special value to bumblebees, and you can search, filter for that as well. Whew, okay, I've got a little bit of time for questions. That was fast. Okay, let's see. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to take some questions. Okay. Here we go. Okay, thank you. Where can you buy the indigo bush? I got that I'm going to go really fast through these. I remember getting that at the North Carolina Botanical Garden. So when I send you all the list of nurseries, they're listed on there. Which of the plants are the most resistant to high deer pressure? In general, that's going to be aromatic plants. And I do need to make a list that includes that. But I think we have lots of deer in our pollinator garden. And I think I minimize damage by the sheer diversity of plants and also mixing in aromatic. Ideal time of year to plant, I already mentioned that was the fall. Plants over a septic drain field. If you want to contact me later, thank you. Don't forget comfrey. Oh, that's fine. I already mentioned comfrey. That's interesting. Okay, yard trimmings, yard waste. Yeah, somebody said don't like leaf litter. I agree. What bees pollinate squash, beans, greens? Yeah, I mean, there's definitely squash bees that are specialists on cucurbits. Some and also other bees and honeybees and things like that. If anybody, we still got a few minutes. If anybody has other questions, pine needles. So I personally prefer for mulch. So there a lot of people don't like using mulch in a garden, and the main reason is it definitely it makes it hard for ground nesting bees to nest because they can't get to the soil. That is true. I could not do my pollinator garden without mulch. I've also created, this would be a whole different talk. I've created, I have plenty of bare ground in the garden anyway for the bees. I've also created a ground nesting bee habitat for them, where I've purposely left bare ground. So that's how that's how I justify using mulch. I just can't have a parking lot bed without mulch, but I try to use as little as I can. So it's kind of personal preference. Pine straw works for some people. I just personally don't like it. If you have it, I guess I would still use it. I mean, I haven't heard people talking about leaving the needles, but yeah, there would still be things that would overwinter among pine needles, just like they would, as they would on leaves. Yeah. You're going to get both schools on pine. Some people love pine straw and some people like leaf hardwood mulch. Yeah. Any other questions before we switch over to Laurie? I was just kind of really quickly went through those, tried to go through those. Yeah, pine straw, that's one of the reasons I don't like pine straw. It does not decompose as quickly. And that's one of the reasons I like hardwood mulch. That's what's improved my soil over the years, is it decomposes and increases the organic matter. And it was really bad soil. So that's one of the reasons I prefer the hardwood mulch. It breaks down quicker. Okay, I don't want this to turn into a hardwood mulch though discussion. So any other questions that yeah, in general, because we're exactly on time. Okay, well, I'm happy to answer questions later. We will we should have some time at the end. We're staying on time, so we should have some time at the end for general questions. So with that, I'm excited for y'all to hear from Laurie Heyman. She's with the Xerces Society, and she's going to talk about the very exciting Southeast Bumblebee project, Atlas. All right, you're up, Laurie.
All right, thanks so much, Debbie. And you got some lovely comments in the chat concerning all the work you do on the Pollinator Paradise Garden, and I just want to echo that. It's an amazing resource for folks learning how to manage their own gardens and what to do. And yeah, thanks so much for having me. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about if you are interested in community science, also known as citizen science, and you want to know a hands-on way to contribute bumblebee data. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas. I'm Lori Heyman. I'm a conservation biologist with the Xerces Society, and I head up the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas, which covers North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Tennessee. And if you are not familiar with the Xerces Society, I just like to first say it out loud because it's an interesting word that not a lot of people know how to pronounce when they first see it. We get our name from a now extinct blue butterfly, and we're a conservation nonprofit that focuses on invertebrates. Hannah talked a little bit about the diversity of bumblebees that we get in the Southeast. We have at least 15 species, and we say at least because there's a number of species that haven't been seen in our area for several decades, and so it's a little unclear whether we can still say whether they're here or not. But this is to give you an idea of sort of the visual diversity of bumblebees that we get in the Southeast. The species in the top left corner, that's those three in that top left corner, the common eastern brown-belted two-spotted, that Hannah gave a little tutorial on how to ID. Those are maybe, if you are looking in your backyard and looking at the bee diversity you're getting, that's maybe 60% of the diversity of bees is those three species. But as Hannah also mentioned, we have a number of species that are facing some degree of extinction risk that we know are experiencing declines. And all in all, roughly a third of our species in the Southeast are considered threatened or vulnerable in some way under the IUCN distinction. So all these species I've outlined in red are declining. And some of them, like the variable cuckoo bumblebee and the rusty patch bumblebee, haven't been seen in our area for several decades. So how do we address this? Well, one of the ways we can address this is through a lot of what Debbie talked about, is creating habitat, creating spaces for bumblebees to thrive. But another way we need to address this is we need to know which species are declining, where they're thriving, where they're struggling, and why they're facing declines. And it's very difficult to do this without having baseline information about where these populations are, where the species are, what time of year they're active, what flowers they're foraging on. Making informed conservation decisions without this kind of data is nearly impossible. So federal agencies and states really depend on data for figuring out which species to list and what habitats to protect. When it comes to the Southeast, we know a little bit about bumblebees, especially compared to other species of bee, as Hannah mentioned, with our 564 species. And we have a long history of people submitting and recording their observations in this area. And on this map here, you can see all the orange dots are where there has been a recorded bumblebee observation. But you may notice if you were to look at this map and you were to guess where bumblebees in the Southeast love it the most, you might guess that they love I-85 and they love that urban corridor between Atlanta and Charlotte. And maybe they love Nashville and the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is that kind of U shape going through the mountains. But obviously this isn't actually the full picture. The distribution of data that we have for bumblebees right now is really biased to where human population centers are, which makes sense. Where people live is where people are going to submit bumblebee observations. But it means we don't have a full picture of where bumblebees are occurring, especially in some of these like West Tennessee and Southeast Georgia and Southeast South Carolina. How these populations are doing in those areas are really unclear. And so to address these sorts of gaps, the Xerces Society started this project called Bumblebee Watch, something in like 2014. And Bumblebee Watch was an iNaturalist-like, basically if you were out and about and you saw a bumblebee, you could snap a pic and submit it. And then experts within the system, usually Xerces employees, but also a system of bumblebee experts would verify the species from your photo so that we could track which species are where. I recommend Bumblebee Watch. At the time Bumblebee Watch was launched, the IDs that were coming in on iNaturalist were a little bit suspect, not always correct, but I think iNaturalist is better these days, and there's a really dedicated community of bumblebee experts that verify bumblebee observations on iNaturalist. So if you're hoping to submit an incidental sighting, you're out and about, you see a bumblebee, you can submit it to either Bumblebee Watch or iNaturalist. That's all good data. However, it's not necessarily systematic data, so those one-off sightings don't come with the full picture information about how long that person spent looking for bees, what the habitat is like, what flower it was necessarily on. And so Xerces decided to launch the Bumblebee Atlas, which was where we use a more formal survey protocol to collect bumblebee data and hopefully to paint a fuller picture about how bumblebees are doing and what habitats best support them. And so this map on the left is where Bumblebee Atlas projects occur at this point. Xerces is headquartered in Portland, Oregon, so we started in the Pacific Northwest in 2018, and we've since expanded to now 20 states. The Southeast Bumblebee Atlas started in last year, 2023 was our first year. And now, as of this year, we're technically coast to coast. We're kind of holding hands with Missouri there. And every year we expand a little bit more. And we're a multi-agency, big collaborative effort. It's not just the Xerces Society. We partner with usually state and federal and sometimes universities to spread these Atlas projects and support them. So for the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas, our specific agencies that we work with are the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And this year we're supported by Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. And with the launch of each of these Bumblebee Atlas projects comes an explosion of observations. So this graph is just showing the number of bumblebee observations over time. In 2018 is when we launched the Pacific Northwest Atlas, and then we've launched successive atlases every year: Nebraska, Missouri, Minnesota, California, and then us last year. And every time an atlas project launches, we get a flurry of new observations in each of those regions and a flurry of new information about bumblebees, where they're occurring and where they're thriving or where they're not thriving. And this sort of data can then be used to make actual applied conservation tools. So for the Pacific Northwest, which has been going on the longest, so we have the most data from, but is the goal for the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas, we now have species summaries for which species occur where, what plant species each of these bumblebees favor, what elevations they occur at, which habitats they prefer, what time of the year they're most active, and where they are likely to occur based on where we've seen them before. So this is all data that is useful for management agencies to figure out how to best protect bumblebees. So with that, I am actually going to do a quick overview about how the Bumblebee Atlas actually works and how one participates. So this is kind of a brief step-by-step of what one does as a participant of the Bumblebee Atlas. So there are 5 main steps. The first step is that we ask people to receive training in order to how to participate in the Atlas. Number 2 is we still submit our data through Bumblebee Watch. So we ask that you create a Bumblebee Watch account. Then we ask that folks adopt a grid cell, and I'll get to what that means in a sec. And then once you've adopted a grid cell, you survey at least 2 times within your grid cell during the field season, which for us this year is between May 1st and September 30th. And then you upload that data to Bumblebee Watch, and one of our experts, and for the Southeast, that's usually me, will go in and see the photos you submitted and then verify which species you've seen so that we can get that data. So I'm going to walk through piece by piece what each of these steps are. So the first step is that we ask that folks get trained. It's quite an involved process or project, so it helps to get a little bit of training. And there are two options for getting trained for this project. The first is to view a recorded training webinar. We actually had our 2024 training webinar the day before yesterday. And so some folks joined live, but we recorded that webinar and it'll hopefully be available on the Bumblebee Atlas website and on the Xerces YouTube by the end of this week so that folks can view it on their own time for at your own pace training. It's about 2 hours where I talk in detail about how to participate in the project. And then another option, which I think is great if you're more of a hands-on learner, and I think they're more fun for me at least. It's fun to actually interact with people in person, is you can attend an in-person workshop. And we have one in-person workshop in each of our partner states, and these workshops are 3 to 4 hours. It's about 3 hours of classroom time and an hour spent outside. And on the right there are our upcoming in-person workshops in 2024. And our North Carolina workshop is going to be at App State University in Boone on May 18th. And then we have supplemental to our workshops and our webinar. If you want to just get a quick hands-on experience, just outdoors, just for the outdoors bit, we have field events, and we have 2 field events per partner state. And on the left are some of the field events that have been scheduled, and most of these have registration links up on the Bumblebee Atlas events page now. And so coming up this weekend, we have one in Savannah, Tennessee, which is West Tennessee. And so I don't expect anyone on this call to get out to West Tennessee. But ones that will be a little bit more close to home that are not featured here is we're going to have one at Green Swamp, probably in early June. So that's in eastern North Carolina. And we're going to have one at Hampton Creek Cove State Natural Area, which is technically Tennessee, but it's like right at the North Carolina border. So those are some somewhat more local options. Also, Francis Marion, maybe that's a little bit close. Congaree National Park is maybe a 5-hour drive. But essentially, we're trying to hop around the Southeast to give people as many opportunities to connect in person to learn how to do these protocols. So once you've received training, we ask that you set up a Bumblebee Watch account. Bumblebee Watch is the platform where participants submit their data. So if you visit the Bumblebee Watch page, you can click up in the top right and you can either sign in or register. And then you adopt a grid cell. And so what I mean by a grid cell is we have divided the Southeast, or these 4 partner states, into 276 grid cells. And each of these cells are approximately 50 kilometers by 50 kilometers, although there are some weird ones in southern Tennessee and West Georgia that are a little stretched out. But in general, they're squares that cover the Southeast. And we ask that folks adopt one of these cells and commit to surveying at least 2 times within their grid cell. And you'll notice that there are different colors on these grid cells here. We consider some grid cells high priority. And there are sort of 2 criteria for how we selected high priority grid cells. One criteria is if that grid cell has a high proportion of rare species, so that people in that area are likely to encounter a rare species. That's obviously a real priority for us. And that's why a lot of the cells in the Blue Ridge Mountain area are considered high priority, because many of our rare bumblebee species prefer montane environments and so are likely to be found in the Blue Ridge Mountain, including rusty patch bumblebee. If we're likely to find it anywhere, it would probably be in the southern Appalachians there. Another reason that some cells become high priority is because they have historically low survey effort. So if you remember back to that map of orange dots, there are regions where we have a lot less bumblebee data, and there are some regions where we have no bumblebee data. So a random subset of these low effort grid cells have been marked as high priority. So for us, that means West Tennessee and a lot of Southeast Georgia and Southeast South Carolina. So we ask that if you're adopting a grid cell, pick one that's fun for you. You can pick one that's close to home. But if you're willing and able to go to that extra mile, so to speak, Adopting a high priority grid cell gets us a long way to getting the data that we need. And this is just to show you, to adopt a grid cell, you go to our website, hover over Get Involved there, and click on our Adopt a Grid Cell page. We have a map there that you can explore grid cell options. You can explore some of the public lands that overlap with grid cells. You can directly type in an address to see which grid cell it's in. And then when you selected that grid cell, you submit an adoption form. And so where can you survey? When you're trying to figure out what kind of grid cell you would want to adopt, where can you survey? Well, it's really flexible. It's basically anywhere you have permission. And we also ask that it have at least 1 hectare of habitat that you're going to be looking at. So a hectare is 2.5 acres. It's like 1.5 football fields. It's 2 soccer fields. It's the interior region of an outdoor track. So it's a good chunk of space that we're asking you to survey when you're selecting an area. But with those 2 criteria in mind, where you have permission and at least a hectare of land, you can survey pretty much anywhere. It can be your land, a friend or family member's land. It can be public right-of-ways. It can be city, county, or local parks after obtaining permission from those site managers. And it can also be state or federal lands. And through the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas, we have a number of permits available. We have kind of a streamlined system for our participants. So we have a form on the website where if you want to survey on a state or federal property, you can submit a form and semi-automatically get connected with the necessary permitting information for that site. And this is just to give you an idea of the kind of lands where we have this streamlined permitting system. For North Carolina, we have permits for North Carolina game lands. We also have a permit for the Great Smoky Mountains, although if you want to survey in that area, you will be interfacing with me directly because they have a few more asks for people surveying on the Smoky Mountains. And then I just wanted to point out, because state parks are popular, if you would like to survey on a state park, we ask that you submit our permitting form by May 30th. And that permitting form will be available by about May 1st. So after May 1st, you can submit a form if you want to survey on a North Carolina state park, and you will be added to the list to be added to a state park permit. So it differs between different types of public areas, which is a bit of a nightmare from a logistical standpoint. But if you are seeking to survey on one of these public lands, it really, having this streamlined system is really helpful for getting access. And so once you actually get to your site, again, we ask that you select an area that's at least a hectare in size, and that you do your 2 surveys between May 1st and September 30th. And then when you get to that area, we ask that you survey for 45 person minutes. And I'll explain what I mean by person minute in a second. And then a survey consists of 1 bumblebee survey and 1 habitat assessment. And this is just reiterating that 2 surveys between May 1st and September 30th. Something I love about being a pollinator biologist is that pollinators love to be out in the same sort of conditions that I like to be out. So sunny days, temperatures between 60 and 90, you don't have to kill yourself on 104-degree days. Some pollinators will hunker down in those high temperatures, and minimal wind are ideal times to survey. And there are a few materials that you'll want to have on hand to commit to conduct a survey. Big essential is an insect net. You'll also want 10 to 25 collection vials or jars. They don't need to be the formal scientific centrifuge vials that you see on the right there. It could be, some people use baby food jars. Some people have used like medicine jars that have been cleaned out really, really well. Craft stores will sell plastic jars that people use for holding beads and sequins. Those are really useful. So just any sort of airtight container that could hold a bumblebee comfortably is useful. Then you'll want something where you can take a picture. This could be a camera or a smartphone. You'll want a cooler or one of those insulated lunch boxes, And then you'll want some ice. Store-bought ice, crushed ice is usually perfect. Something to write with, a stopwatch or timer. I just use my smartphone. Those permits I talked about, transportation to get to your site, and then because we're human, making sure that you have water and sun and heat protection. And then the survey itself, I'm going to describe a little bit what that actually looks like. So you're going to search for bumblebees across your hectare, approximately a hectare, for 45 person minutes. You don't need to go over the site with a fine-tooth comb. Just look at flowering plants for 45 person minutes and do your best to capture every bumblebee that you encounter. You're not going to capture everyone, especially at first, but do your best to capture every bumblebee that you encounter. When I say person minutes, I mean that if you are surveying in a group, your total combined time should be at least 45 person minutes. So if you are surveying in a group of 3, you can each search for bumblebees for 15 minutes apiece, and that counts as your 45 person minutes. Then when you catch a bumblebee, you're going to transfer her to a vial. And then you are going to put that vial on ice, and that is going to safely cold anesthetize her to a point where you can take scientific voucher quality photographs to submit on Bumblebee Watch. After you have photographed all of your bees, all of your chilled bees, they warm up in about 5 minutes and they get right back to doing their bumblebee business. And then when you've done that, then you conduct a really brief habitat survey where you collect really coarse information about what this habitat was like. Was it mostly wooded? Was it an open meadow? Did you observe any sort of human management at that site? How many roughly flowering species did you observe? That sort of information. It takes people about 5 to 20 minutes to do the habitat survey. And Debbie mentioned this earlier, we're also keeping track of which host plants we're finding these bumblebees on. That's really useful information for figuring out which plant species are high priority for bumblebees. And the way that we typically encourage folks to do this is when you capture a bumblebee and transfer them to a vial, number that vial and then take a picture of that vial with the flower that you caught her on. And that way, when you're submitting photos later, you can write which flower that bee was caught on. I like to address this because this is a new concept for a lot of folks, and it can be alarming for certain people. But yep, we let our bees chill out on ice. It's a slow way to slow the movements of insects so that you can safely handle them and take really close photos for Bumblebee Watch. It takes about 10 to 20 minutes for the bee on ice to chill enough for you to take photos. They can safely stay on ice for quite a long time. We recommend up to 2 hours. And we ask that you make sure that your ice is not much colder than freezing. Some freezers are like super freezers and they freeze ice to below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And that can be a little bit dangerous for bees. We also ask that people avoid those sort of gel or chiller packs that you use for injuries or for keeping your lunch cool in lunch boxes. Usually store-bought ice is usually just right. Crushed ice is my favorite. Hotel ice is perfect. I understand you don't need to go into a hotel and steal their ice, but I'm often staying in hotels when I do these workshops. So just a little tip, hotel ice is perfect. Then when you've taken your pictures, you've finished your survey, you've done your habitat assessment, now you go home and you upload your data to Bumblebee Watch. Now you have that account, you just go to the site and click Add Bumblebee Sightings, and this is where you submit your data. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, we have 1 year under our belts now. We have our field season from last year. I just want to talk about how our first year went. So on this map here, every grid cell that is orange is where one survey occurred, and every grid cell that is red is where it was surveyed to completion with 2 or more surveys. Each pentagon shape is where a survey occurred, and each pentagon shape with a dot in it is where a survey occurred where they found bumblebees. So something really key about our project compared to like incidental sightings like you would submit on iNaturalist is that we also collect null surveys, we're interested to know if you went out to a site and you searched for 45 person minutes and you didn't see any bumblebees, that's still valuable information, and we ask that you submit that. So last year we had 80 unique participants. We had 69 out of our 276 grid cells with surveys. We had 270 some odd surveys done last year. People observed over 2,000 bumblebees of at least 10 species, which is really exciting considering that we have at least 15. 10 is a pretty good chunk for our area. But you'll notice that we're still being mapped out to these population centers. We're still mostly in the populated areas of the Piedmont and Nashville. And so we have these areas where in 2024, we're really encouraging people to go out of their way to go to these areas. And that's why some of our workshops are in some of these areas, is to encourage people to survey in these spots. Just a rundown of our species. So this is just a literal count of which species that we observed in 2023. Our most seen species by far was the common eastern bumblebee, Bombus impatiens. That accounted for something like 60 to 70% of all the species, all the individuals that we saw. But something that is interesting and a little warming is that our second most observed species in 2023 was the American bumblebee, Bombus pennsylvanicus, which is considered a vulnerable species. And it's mainly declining in the northern part of its range. As Hannah mentioned, it seems to be doing okay here. And that seems to be reflected in the data we observed. Bombus pennsylvanicus was our second most observed species. And we also are, I'm also really excited about the plant data that we got in 2023. So we're already getting a better picture, especially for some of our rare or vulnerable species, about what plant types they prefer. So just sort of anecdotally, a native plant species that seemed to be really popular with American bumblebee is Dasystoma macrophylla. I'm sorry, I don't have the common name there. But at one particular survey that I was a part of, they were really flocking to this one species. For Bombus fraternus, the Southern Plains bumblebee, which is my personal favorite, it's a really beautiful bee. Its most popular plant was Clethra alnifolia, that sweet pepper bush, which is one that Debbie mentioned. And in fact, one of the surveys I participated in, we were searching for bumblebees for about an hour. We weren't seeing anything. We were getting really disappointed. And then someone turned a corner and found a field of sweet pepper bush, and the Southern Plains bumblebee, this IUCN endangered species, was going absolutely nutso on this sweet pepper bush. So knowing which plant species these bumblebees prefer is really insightful information. Here's some quick FAQ, some questions that I get a lot. Can you do more than 2 surveys? Yes, please do. More data is always welcome. You can survey with a group. It's fun to make this a social activity. Sometimes people adopt a grid cell as a company or as a school or a church. And yes, feel free to make it a social activity. Just keep in mind that when you're surveying in a group, you're adding up everyone's effort to make up those person minutes. Do you survey at the same spot every time within your grid cell? So our sort of golden standard is that you're surveying the same spot each time you go out. So your minimum 2 surveys will be ideally at the same spot. However, you're not required to do this. You can survey at several different spots. And you can survey several spots on the same day. Our sort of golden standard is surveying the same spot spaced apart by a few weeks. That just makes it more straightforward from a data analysis standpoint, but you are free to fulfill those 2 surveys within your grid cell, whichever way you want. More than one person can adopt a grid cell. I cap it at 5 people. So if you go to our website and you explore that grid cell map, there's actually an option to look at how many people have adopted each grid cell, so you can get an idea of which grid cells have been adopted and by how many. So we cap it at 5, and this is our way of encouraging people to spread out so we don't just keep focusing our efforts in Charlotte and Atlanta. You can absolutely adopt more than 1 cell. Some people do. Just be sure that you're prepared to commit to those two surveys within each grid cell. And with that, I just want to acknowledge the Xerces Society supporters and also our partners and collaborators on this project. And with that, I think I have time to take questions.
Oh, that's great. Great job, Lori. I'm so excited. Yeah, we definitely have we have half an hour left. That's great. Okay, so let's look at questions. Someone I guess wanted you to remind them, what areas do you need a permit for? And if private property, do they just need verbal permission?
Yeah, that's a great question. In general, you need a permit for those state and federal properties. So things like state parks, game lands, national parks, national forests, usually county and local and state parks. An email suffices. And for private property, yes, just permission from the landowner. Probably best to get written permission just for your protection is usually adequate. So just as long as you have permission in some format, you're good to go. What month do more people survey? That's a good question. Last year, I think because we were rolling out last year and people were learning and figuring out how to get out into the field, a lot of our people surveyed later in the season, so sort of August, even into September, which is fine. But this year, we're hoping to get more people out earlier in the season to catch more of that early season activity, especially when those workers are active. So if I had a recommendation for the best time to survey, it would be May, June, the sort of the first half of our season. I think that's when you're going to see some of our more interesting species.
Can I add a cautionary tale there?
Sure.
Lori probably knows what I'm going to say. So I was all excited to do the Atlas project last year, and I get so busy with the pollinator garden, both managing it and giving tours. But so I was kind of waiting to do my 2 surveys, and I waited. Well, okay, so I'll wait till I waited till the September. I think it was like the last week, but still plenty of time, right? Well, would you know that was the literally did not see a single bumblebee. And I had what she called a null survey, which is really unusual because I can document through my photos that I see bumblebees every year all the way through November even. So my warning is, don't wait till the end of September like I did. Because even though the survey lets you wait that long, it may be some freak thing where all the bumblebees, they must know that you're waiting to catch them and they just disappear for a week that week. So I'm definitely not going to wait until the last week this year, because I hated it. I didn't see a single, and it wasn't just that day, it was the whole week prior to that. I don't know where all the bumblebees went. So
Yeah, and no one's blaming you, Debbie, but we did have that we did have a field event at the pollinator Paradise Garden earlier in the year, I think June, and
yeah.
it was an explosion of bumblebees, and we'd
Yes.
love for you to capture that
Yes.
diversity.
Well, yeah, so fortunately we at least had that survey. And then of course, after the close of the Atlas at the end of September, then the bumblebees came back. So
As they do.
as they do. But anyway, there's another question. Let's see. And yeah, y'all keep putting your questions in for Lori. It says for private land, oh, that was just a comment.
There's a question from April about you've been taking photos at a local flower farm and would like to contribute data, but don't know if you can commit to the Bumblebee Watch requirements. That's totally fine. If you can't commit to those 2 surveys, there's still valuable information that you can submit. So you can either submit those incidental one-off, like I saw a bumblebee. You can submit those as incidental observations to the Bumblebee Watch site. It'll direct you to how to submit those, or you can submit those to iNaturalist. That data ultimately still ends up in our system and in state and federal system. So either one. At this point, I find, not to put down Bumblebee Watch, but I use iNaturalist all the time. So if you're already comfortable with iNaturalist, keep submitting sightings on iNaturalist. How many people do the training? I hope there could be more dates near North Carolina. So so last year, at least the recorded webinar got something like 300 views. And we had something like 200 people attend workshops and field events. So several hundred people, and then a minority, like a chunk of that actually end up doing the surveys. But we have those recorded webinars. If you don't have a chance to get to an in-person event, you can learn at your own pace using that recorded webinar.
So Lori, the webinar that was it last night for the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas?
It was 2 nights ago.
2 nights ago, once that recording is available, I can send that out to this group.
That'd be awesome.
And you mentioned for the field trainings, you mentioned, because it wasn't on the slide, that there is one for North Carolina. So if you have the details for that already, I can get that from you and send that out in my follow-up email. Because
That'd be great. Yeah.
the field training is great, you guys, because that gives you the practice in catching the bumblebees and getting them from the net to the vial. Because she mentioned there's like one, I forgot the date, but anyway, so we'll get that in the email to you if y'all wanted to do that, and you can watch the webinar recording, you know, and that'll give you kind of more background. So I'll follow up with her. Okay.
Thanks, Debbie.
And just to clarify, Lori, correct me if I'm wrong, but you are the only one doing the training for the Southeastern Bumblebee project. It's all the states are trained by Lori. Amazing work, very amazing. So that's why there may not be dates right where you are, because it's only Lori right now.
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, my closest Xerces compatriot is in Virginia. Otherwise, I'm the only Southeastern Xerces employee. I love traveling around, but yeah, I have limited ability.
Yeah, because your job, Lori, is like, are you the manager for the Southeast Bumblebee Atlas, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, we're lucky she's based right here in our backyard. Woo!
That's
We
why a
can't
lot of
bother.
our that's why a lot of our observations are from the triangle. Is that local bias?
Any other questions for Lori? Because if not, we can switch to general questions, and then if we don't have any of those, we can do announcements. So any questions for me, Hannah, or Lori at this point? Are y'all bumblebeed out? Oh, okay. Are there special, oh, that's very interesting. Are there special considerations for those who have honeybee hives and want to encourage and care? Yeah, that was very interesting. You know, yeah, they're definitely, yeah. Lori, do you want to take that one?
I think Hannah unmuted to maybe start to address that. Did you
okay.
have something you want to say, Hannah?
Yeah, whoever, I'm sure we all have things we can say. So the main concerns, if you're bringing in honeybee hives and also want to support bumblebees, are that there's enough forage for everyone and that your honeybees are healthy. So make sure there's enough flowers. Honeybees have tens of thousands of individuals. Bumblebee colonies can have hundreds or thousands of individuals. That's a lot of bees in one area. So make sure there's enough forage for everyone. But then also, there is some research showing that honeybees, when they get sick with viruses and especially those gut parasites, and when they visit a flower, if another bee visits the same flower, there's a chance that they could make each other sick. Or you need to really stay on top of checking your hives. If there's an issue treating your hives, make sure they are healthy, because they can spread those pathogens to other colonies, but also potentially other species, including bumblebees. And those gut parasites are something we're really concerned about with bumblebees specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was on over the weekend, I guess it was Xerces that did a webinar, and they were talking about yeah, definitely being careful about just the distance with bumblebees and honeybees and being mindful of that for sure. Yeah. Plants to direct sow now. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do, annuals and stuff, but I mean, I prefer to do direct sowing of perennials in the fall. I think you have better success with that. Things like that I mentioned in my presentation, like Well, I mean, like columbine, it blooms now. It's blooming now, so you wouldn't seed that now. And thistle, I wouldn't seed that now because it's going to bloom soon. So those are all things you'd want to do in the fall, but there's annual things that you could seed now, so it depends on what it is. Mosquito spray affecting bumbles. Anybody want to? Yeah, we haven't even talked about pesticides that much. We did a little bit. No, that's true. And I could have talked a whole lot about it as well. Because that's what like things that bees need. Well, they need not to be bothered by pesticides. I mean, that's a big part of it. That's a big threat. And so we don't always have control over it, especially when it's your neighbor that's doing it. And that is huge. And Hannah talked about it as one of the big threats to bumblebees and bees in general. And we don't, and not just as what your neighbor is doing, but what's coming in on seed and things like that as well. Plants that are coming in that are sprayed with neonics that you may not even be aware of. Yeah.
I'll add really quick for mosquito sprays. So if someone is licensed to spray pesticides, they are supposed to follow the label, and the label requires them to not spray on blooming flowers when bees are expected to be foraging. And that also includes considerations for drift. So if you see that that's not being followed, they are not following the label, you can either talk to the company, or the North Carolina Department of Agriculture has a pesticide unit that addresses concerns such as this, or addresses bee kills that if you are concerned it might be pesticide related, they can come out and take a look. So there are considerations on labels to hopefully lead to careful, successful use of pesticides where they are needed. But if you see someone not following those restrictions, that is an issue. So they shouldn't be spraying on open flowers, and it's preferred that they're spraying in the evening when bees are not active. But so there's that consideration. So if it's outside of those uses, it might be something to talk to someone further about.
And Xerces has some good publications about neonics and effects on bees. You could look those up, or I could try to put those in the follow-up email if somebody had asked about those as well.
I dropped a link in the chat, Debbie.
Oh, okay, great. Oh gosh, we're getting a whole bunch. Okay, we're getting let's see. But let's try to keep things that are specific to bumblebees. Just because we can't answer every gardening or pesticide question necessarily. That planting. What? Okay, let me copy this link. If anybody sees something they want to address, go ahead. I'm kind of multitasking here. Copy.
I can speak a little bit to the question about what happens when you see bees that are chilled out on a flower or plant. I think maybe it was Debbie or maybe Hannah that talked about at least for male bumblebees, they don't live inside the nest, so they may spend the night in a flower or a plant, just chilling out, sometimes in aggregations. Also, if it's a cool part of the day, or maybe it's early in the morning and things are still a bit wet and dewy, or maybe it's just rained, they might not have the ability to fly around. Maybe they're still warming up and they're just getting the energy sitting there in a sunny spot waiting to warm up. Yeah.
And I see a question about non-native coneflowers. I'll address this somewhat in that it's more, in my opinion, and Debbie can add to this, I'm sure Lori too, but not every plant produces pollen and nectar. And then even if it's a native species, sometimes the bred cultivars change the resources that are available to bees. So it's not necessarily only if it's a native or a non-native, it's really, we need to look at the cultivar and what resources that cultivar is providing to wildlife, and in this case, bumblebees. So if it's a cultivar that is providing resources, that's great. Sometimes even things that are considered like native species, but it's a different cultivar, may not. So I wouldn't make such a broad statement that all non-native plants are sterile. It's more to do with the breeding of that plant cultivar.
Yeah, my stance on cultivars, because some people say you shouldn't use them at all. And I'm not one, I don't say that. I think research has shown that basically it depends. The Mount Cuba Center has looked at, done research on some and seen that in some cases cultivars are more attractive to certain pollinators. So the way I look at that is I try to use mostly straight species in my garden, but I use some cultivars as well because I've got plenty of resources. Now, the cultivars that are definitely not going to benefit pollinators are going to be things that are double flowered or, for example, pollenless. I work with cut flower growers and they grow pollenless sunflowers because their customers don't want bouquets of flowers shedding pollen on their white tablecloths, which sounds kind of ridiculous, but so obviously that's not necessarily going to benefit bees. But my point is unless you research every single cultivar, we don't know the quality of that nectar or pollen necessarily for that particular cultivar. So I think if you had if your garden was full only of cultivars, we might be concerned. So my pollinator garden of 225 species, most of those are straight species. There's a handful of cultivars. I'm not concerned, right? And of those cultivars, I see many, many pollinators visiting them. So I think use your head. I think it's okay to have a few cultivars. I'm not, my approach is not to tell people that you can't use them. I think you need to just be balanced with it, that's the way I look at it, but I do try to, and I don't even say you don't have any double flowers. It's okay to have a plant that has double flowers, but it's not going to benefit pollinators. It doesn't mean it's the worst thing in the world. You got all these other plants that benefit pollinators. I mean, I just try to look at it that way, let's see. Hang on, let's see. Plant for bumblebees. So the question, I live on a third acre. My next door neighbor has honeybees, but won't plant flowers because she thinks they can all come to my yard. Yeah, that gets my goat because so I do a lot of talks to beekeepers. And my message to beekeepers, and I was a beekeeper for a few years. And beekeeping, you're a livestock manager when you're a beekeeper. You're managing livestock. And the way I look at it is you have a responsibility to feed your livestock, i.e., you must plant flowers for them. You can't just turn them out into the world and expect them to go find their own food. I think that's irresponsible. So in this case, it sounds like her neighbor is turning out her bees and expecting them to go find their own food, which, oh, well, my neighbor has flowers. That's good enough. And that creates more problems with competition with our native bees, right? And in a county like Chatham County, where we're having so much habitat loss, I have grave concerns about we keep creating more and more beekeepers and we're losing more and more habitat. And if our beekeepers, and I'm not saying this is happening here, but if beekeepers are not planting habitat for their bees and expecting them just to go find their own food, then it's going to have a worse impact on native bees. So I try to instill into our new beekeepers, you have a responsibility to plant food for your bees. And even then, they're not going to be able to plant nearly enough, for those bees, but at least you can put a den in it. So that beekeeper's being irresponsible, in my opinion. They need to be planting plants for their own bees. Do we need to provide water sources for bumblebees? I mean, it's always nice, I like to have little bird baths and around the garden, very shallow sources. I do that for my pollinators, so I think that's nice. I think they would appreciate that. I'd like to save a little bit of time if we can, for any of our members that might have announcement. That's kind of a tradition for our Chatham Conservation, meetings. You all okay with that? Lori and Hannah? Okay, so if anybody who's out there wants to unmute themselves, if you have any announcements that are pertinent to CCP, if you'd like to share them about events or any upcoming events or anything like that, now would be a good time to do that. We got a few minutes left to do that. And if not, we'll just continue taking more questions. Or you can put it in the chat if you want, and I'll call on you. Or read it out for you. And Brooke, if you have anything you want to add, she's our other CCP steering committee member that's present.
No, don't. It's sassy.
Anybody, any of our members out there have any announcements about community events or concerns or happenings?
Oh, I do. We did put this out on the listserv, but just to remind the audience in case they weren't keeping track, there is Chatham's UDO is up for public review. And UDO, the UDO is really going to set the standards for development in Chatham County. So it's a good idea to take a look at it and see that, things are happening the way you want it to happen. And I can put the link in the chat, but it's also in the list. Sorry, but I'll put it in there in case.
So how do they, what is the action item? How do they take a look at it? What do they do when they look at it?
Yeah, well, usually I don't recall. So there's usually like a public comment period, so you can write to your to the Board of Commissioners or speak at a public hearing. I don't know what specific opportunities I have for providing outreach, but that's usually how,
Okay.
or for receiving feedback, but usually they have some sort of mechanism for receiving feedback. I don't know the details, but it should say that in that link, which I have
Okay.
not myself looked at yet, but
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
While we're waiting for other announcements, a question about when I said bird baths for the pollinators, you can empty that out every couple of days. That would solve the mosquito larvae problem. Yeah. Any other announcements? From anybody out there? Y'all are being awfully quiet. My goodness.
Can I answer a question while we wait, Debbie?
Sure, absolutely.
Also on the bird bath, if you put an agitator in, that can help, but I think it's good to change the water out every so often. There was a question about carpenter bees creating competition for bumblebees. So both of those species are native here to North Carolina. So unless you're bringing in bumblebee colonies, it's not like you are changing the landscape like we're talking about with bringing in managed colonies. I would say that just as a numbers game, the bumblebee colonies, there's hundreds of those per colony. So by the numbers, it's probably not as big of a concern, but just as a general blanket statement, as long as there's enough floral resources for everyone to go around. So even with these native pollinators, we want to make sure we're putting habitat back into the landscape as it's being developed, so there's enough for everyone.
Great. Someone said to me privately, there's the Haw River Festival is in Saxapahaw on May 4th. Okay. So we had a question about when is the least harmful time for a needed mowing or leaf removal? So that's always a tough one. The leaves. Okay, great. We've left the leaves. We've got through the winter. We're in the spring. So we're mid-April now. Okay, now what? When can I start? So we in my pollinator garden, we have started the mulching. And we actually had a few leaves on top of the bed still yesterday. And what we did, I have a feeling everything's pretty much woken up by now, right? Anything that was in there, but just in case, we gently pulled out some of the leaves and basically relocated them. We just pulled them out and put them under a nearby tree, right? So, because we do have to, we figured it was already time that they had, there wasn't anything in there anyway, but just in case that that we didn't, we just basically relocated it. So there's no hard and fast data on that around here, but I figure mid-April, especially when it's been in the 80s, almost 90 degrees, that we're pretty safe. I don't know if Hannah wants to add anything on that, but so.
Yeah, I'll add, and I'll first echo, there's not a lot of good data about leaf litter and overwintering. There's some research we're trying to do at NC State to get some more information about that. What I will say is what we found so far is like in the gardens with stems and leaf litter, basically once you put out a resource for wildlife, you should probably assume that it's always being used by some organism in the environment. That's the whole point, right? So if you're leaving leaves, they are going to turn into mulch. So I would ask you to consider, do you really need to move them? Like if you're doing something else like Debbie's talking about where like there's something you're doing, that makes sense. But if you're just trying to tinker around in the garden, maybe consider continuing to leave them and they'll break down because there's probably always something using it. But like Debbie mentioned, I think that once the spring is really active, especially like May and June, there's going to be a ton of resources. So if you disturb one resource, it's more likely that they will have another one they can go to. But fall and winter is a really critical time where there's not a lot of resources available. So not messing with them during that time is what I would suggest.
Yeah, and if we had enough fallen leaves to use as mulch, we would. We don't. So the only reason I relocate them is because I don't want to put mulch on top of them. And because if anything's in there, it would stand a better chance. I don't think there is, but it would stand a better chance of, being relocated. Yeah. So still, okay, I'm just looking at these. Lori put in something about an article where Hannah's in the article. I haven't seen this. But I don't have in and no access, so I guess I have to be maybe Hannah, you can send it to. I don't know if I can see it though, if you don't have it in. Okay, let's see. I have some ones. Ways to manage woodlands. Ways to manage woodlands to support bumbles. I have some woods as well. I mean, there's lots of woodland flowers, out there. There's lots of let's see. Well, fallen trees wouldn't be so much for bumble. I mean, there's lots of nesting habitat, I would say, potentially in woods. So just kind of not disturbing it would be good, right? Hannah's shaking her head in agreement, I think. Yeah. Just keeping out invasives probably would be a good strategy, things like that. But yeah, but keeping out the invasives allows your spring ephemerals and other native plants to take hold. Yeah. Okay, well, we are pretty much reached the end of our time. Does anybody last chance for any announcements or anything from our speakers? I will, like I said, I'll be sending out a follow-up email in a day or so. Give me a little bit of time, but and the recording, of course, y'all aren't as interested in the recording because you actually got to see it live, but we appreciate y'all being here. I really thank my other two speakers. We are so lucky to have them here, really. I mean, I feel so lucky to be able to turn to Hannah and her cohort, Elsa, at NC State. They're my native bee specialists. When I have a native bee question I can't answer, I turn to them, and so excited to have Lori here now with the Bumblebee Atlas project. So we're very lucky to have them right nearby. But thanks guys for attending and having great questions, and have a wonderful rest of the week.